Some mysteries are never meant to be solved. They linger in the shadows, whispered from generation to generation, defying logic and explanation. Tonight, we journey into the depths of the unknown, where reality bends and the impossible becomes disturbingly real. From eerie disappearances to unexplained phenomena, these are 10 of the strangest and most chilling unsolved mysteries in history. Turn down the lights, listen closely, and ask yourself, what if the truth is far stranger than we could ever imagine? The Dyatlov Pass incident. The crisp autumn air bit at the exposed skin, a stark contrast to the warmth radiating from the packed Yuba City High School gymnasium. 5 young men, close friends since childhood, roared with the rest of the crowd as the Honkers, their local team, battled their rivals from Marysville. There was Gary Mathias, the quiet leader, always thinking several steps ahead. Next to him was Jack Madruga, the joker of the group, his infectious laughter echoing through the stands. Then there was Bill Sterling, the athlete, broad-shouldered and quick with a playful jab. Following close behind was Ted Weiher, the gentle giant, a man of few words but immense loyalty. And finally, there was Jackie Hewitt, the youngest, his eyes wide with excitement, soaking in the electric atmosphere. The final buzzer sounded, the Honkers victorious. The 5 friends, energized by the game, decided to grab a bite to eat at a local burger joint before heading home. It was a Friday night, the start of the weekend, and the possibilities seemed endless. They piled into Gary's Mercury Montego, the radio blasting classic rock, and headed out. Little did they know, this ordinary Friday night would be the last normal night of their lives. They never made it to the burger joint. The following morning, their families awoke to find them missing. At first, it was assumed they'd simply decided to stay out late, maybe even camp overnight in the nearby mountains. It wasn't entirely unusual for the adventurous group, but as the day wore on, and then turned into night, a gnawing unease began to settle in. They hadn't contacted anyone. They hadn't returned home. A missing persons report was filed with the Yuba City Police Department. The initial investigation yielded nothing. No witnesses, no leads, no sign of the 5 young men. The police questioned their friends, their families, anyone who might have seen them that night. The only clue was a vague recollection from a gas station attendant who thought he might have seen a car matching the description of Gary's Montego heading towards the Plumas National Forest. The Plumas National Forest, a vast expanse of rugged terrain, dense forests, and hidden valleys stretching across the Sierra Nevada mountains. It was a place of breathtaking beauty, but also a place of isolation and unpredictable weather. The thought of the 5 young men lost in those unforgiving mountains sent a chill down the spines of their families. A search party was organized, comprised of local volunteers, experienced hikers, and law enforcement officers. They scoured the forest, following trails, checking campsites, calling out the names of the missing men. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, but the search yielded nothing. It was as if the 5 friends had simply vanished into thin air. Then, 3 months later, a break in the case. A group of deer hunters stumbled upon an abandoned vehicle deep within the Plumas National Forest. It was Gary's Mercury Montego. It was parked haphazardly, half hidden by a thicket of pine trees, as if it had been abandoned in a hurry. The car was unlocked, the keys still in the ignition. Inside, they found some personal belongings of the missing men: wallets, a backpack, a map of the forest. But there was no sign of the men themselves. The discovery of the car reignited the search, but with renewed urgency. The harsh winter months were approaching, and the chances of finding the men alive were dwindling with each passing day. The search party focused their efforts around the area where the car was found, meticulously combing the surrounding forest. A few days later, they found something: a single shoe, half buried in the snow. It was identified as belonging to Jackie Hewitt. The search intensified, and a short distance away, they found more clues: a discarded cigarette pack, a half-eaten candy bar, a crumpled map. All of these items seemed to point in a single direction, deeper into the forest. Following this trail of breadcrumbs, the search party finally came upon a remote, dilapidated cabin. It was a small, one-room structure, barely visible through the dense trees. The windows were boarded up, and the door was hanging precariously on its hinges. An eerie silence hung in the air, broken only by the rustling of the wind through the trees. As the search party cautiously approached the cabin, they noticed something strange. A series of footprints, leading away from the cabin and into the surrounding wilderness. They were the footprints of multiple people, and they seemed to be heading in no particular direction, wandering aimlessly through the dense forest. The footprints were also peculiar in that some of them seemed to be made by people wearing only thin-soled shoes, even though the ground was covered in snow. A sense of dread washed over the search party as they entered the cabin. The air inside was stale and cold, heavy with the scent of damp wood and something else. Something indescribable. Something that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. The cabin was sparsely furnished, containing only a few rudimentary items. A rickety table, a couple of chairs, a wood-burning stove. There was no food, no sign of bedding, no indication that anyone had been living there for any length of time. And then they found the bodies. 3 of them, huddled together in a corner of the cabin, frozen solid. They were identified as Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, and Ted Weiher. Their faces were contorted in expressions of terror, their eyes wide with fear. It was as if they had seen something so horrifying that it had frozen them in place. The condition of the bodies was even more disturbing. Despite the fact that there was no food in the cabin, Ted Weiher, the largest of the group, had clearly died of starvation. His stomach was shrunken, his ribs protruding through his skin. The other 2 bodies showed signs of severe dehydration. The search party was baffled. How could 3 men, in a cabin stocked with firewood and surrounded by a forest teeming with game, starve to death? It made no sense. The discovery of the bodies only deepened the mystery. Where were Gary Mathias and Jackie Hewitt? And what had happened to the 3 men in the cabin? What had they seen that had terrified them so? The discovery of the 3 bodies in the cabin sent shockwaves through Yuba City. The initial confusion and hope for a safe return had morphed into something darker, something far more sinister. The police investigation intensified, but the bizarre circumstances surrounding the deaths only deepened the mystery. The autopsy reports on Madruga, Sterling, and Weiher revealed some unsettling details. While the official cause of death was attributed to hypothermia and starvation, the condition of their bodies raised more questions than answers. Their internal organs showed signs of severe stress, as if they had been subjected to extreme physical exertion in the moments leading up to their deaths. Yet, there was no evidence of any external injuries, no broken bones, no signs of a struggle. The starvation of Ted Weiher, in particular, was a puzzle. The cabin was located in a region abundant with wildlife, and the men were known to be skilled hunters. Why hadn't they simply gone out and hunted for food? There was plenty of firewood available to keep the cabin warm, and a nearby stream provided a source of fresh water. The fact that they had starved to death in these circumstances was inexplicable. The footprints found outside the cabin added another layer of intrigue to the case. The fact that some of the footprints were made by people wearing only thin-soled shoes, despite the snow-covered ground, suggested that the men had left the cabin in a state of panic or disorientation. Where were they going? And why were they so ill-prepared for the harsh winter conditions? The search for Gary Mathias and Jackie Hewitt continued, but the hope of finding them alive had all but vanished. The vastness of the Plumas National Forest, coupled with the approaching winter storms, made the search increasingly difficult. Weeks turned into months, and still, there was no sign of the 2 missing men. Then, in the spring of the following year, another grim discovery. Hikers stumbled upon a shallow grave not far from the cabin. Inside, they found the skeletal remains of Jackie Hewitt. His bones were badly decomposed, making it impossible to determine the cause of death. However, one chilling detail stood out. A small, intricately woven doll was found clutched in his skeletal hand. The doll was unlike anything the locals had ever seen. its design strangely unsettling, almost ritualistic. The discovery of Hewitt's remains brought a renewed sense of dread to the investigation. The doll, with its strange and unsettling design, hinted at something far more sinister than a simple case of misadventure. The police began to explore the possibility of foul play, but there was no evidence to suggest that anyone else had been involved in the disappearance and deaths of the 5 men. The mystery surrounding the Dyatlov Pass incident, American version, deepened with each new discovery, each new piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. The lack of any clear motive, the bizarre circumstances surrounding the deaths, and the unsettling details of the case all contributed to a growing sense of unease. The local community was gripped by fear and speculation. Rumors began to circulate, whispers of strange rituals, hidden cults, and supernatural forces at work in the depths of the Plumas National Forest. Some claimed that the 5 men had stumbled upon something they weren't meant to see, something ancient and malevolent that had claimed their lives. The police, however, remained focused on finding a rational explanation for the events. They interviewed dozens of people, re-examined the evidence, and consulted with experts in various fields. But the more they investigated, the more baffling the case became. There were simply too many unanswered questions, too many inconsistencies, too many strange and inexplicable details. The case of the 5 missing men from Yuba City became a local legend, a chilling reminder of the mysteries that lie hidden in the vast and untamed wilderness. The Dyatlov Pass incident, the American version, as it came to be known, remained unsolved, a haunting enigma that continued to baffle investigators and fuel the imaginations of those who dared to delve into its dark secrets. Gary Mathias was never found. His disappearance remains one of the most perplexing aspects of the case. Did he meet the same fate as his friends? Or did he somehow escape the clutches of whatever dark force had claimed their lives? The answer to that question, like so many others in this tragic story, remains lost to the shadows of the Plumas National Forest. The Green Children of Woolpit. The year is 1135. A thick fog clung to the fields surrounding Woolpit, a small, unremarkable village nestled in the heart of Suffolk, England. The air was heavy, damp, and carried the earthy scent of freshly turned soil and ripening wheat. For generations, the villagers had lived a simple, predictable life, their days dictated by the rhythm of the seasons. But the whispers began that autumn, carried on the same wind that rustled the golden wheat stalks. Whispers of strange figures seen lurking at the edge of the woods, whispers of unsettling cries echoing in the night. Most dismissed them as superstition, the product of overactive imaginations fueled by long days and darker nights. Yet, a seed of unease had been planted, and it began to sprout in the fertile ground of their collective fear. One crisp morning, as Thomas, a farmer, went to check his wheat fields, he noticed something peculiar. A section of the field, near the dense, shadowy woods bordering the village, was trampled, not in the haphazard way animals might have passed through, but with a strange, almost deliberate pattern. The stalks were bent and broken, forming a sort of pathway leading deeper into the woods. A shiver ran down his spine, despite the chill morning air. He'd heard the whispers, and now, seeing this, it felt like confirmation of something unnatural. He called for his neighbor, John, a burly man with a reputation for bravery, or perhaps foolishness. John examined the trampled wheat, his brow furrowed. "Looks like deer," he grunted, but his voice lacked conviction. The way the wheat was broken, the distinct lack of hoof prints, something didn't add up. "Deer don't walk like this," Thomas argued, pointing to the almost linear path carved through the field. "And have you heard the stories? The strange cries?" John scoffed. "Old wives' tales, Thomas. Just stories to scare children." But even as he spoke the words, he glanced nervously towards the dark woods, the shadows seeming to deepen and writhe beneath the thick canopy of leaves. They decided to follow the trail, armed with nothing but their farm tools. Thomas with his scythe and John with his sturdy walking stick, they ventured into the woods. The air grew colder, the sunlight struggled to penetrate the dense foliage, and an unsettling silence descended, broken only by the crunch of their boots on fallen leaves. The trail led them deeper and deeper, winding through the trees like a serpent. The sense of unease grew with every step, the feeling of being watched, of something unseen lurking just beyond the periphery of their vision. After what felt like hours, they stumbled upon a clearing. In the center, a sight that made their blood run cold. A small, crudely dug pit, and beside it, two children. They were unlike any children Thomas and John had ever seen. Their skin was a distinct, unsettling shade of green. Not the pale green of a sickly plant, but a vibrant, almost luminous green. The boy and girl, perhaps no more than 10 and 6 years old respectively, were dressed in ragged clothing of an unfamiliar material. They huddled together, their eyes wide with fear, and spoke to each other in a language neither Thomas nor John had ever heard. It sounded strange, alien, with sharp clicks and whistles. The children recoiled when Thomas and John approached, their eyes filled with terror. They scrambled back, trying to escape, but they were weak and malnourished. The boy, smaller than his sister, seemed particularly frail. Thomas and John, despite their initial shock and fear, felt a surge of pity for the strange children. They looked lost, scared, and vulnerable. "We won't hurt you," Thomas said slowly, trying to project a sense of calm. He reached out a hand cautiously, but the children only cried out louder, their strange, guttural cries echoing through the silent woods. Thomas and John, despite their fear and confusion, knew they couldn't leave the children in the woods. They were clearly lost and in need of help, even if they were different. With slow, deliberate movements, they approached the children, speaking softly, trying to convey their good intentions. The children, huddled together like frightened animals, continued to cry, their strange language a series of panicked chirps and whistles. John, ever the pragmatist, offered them some bread he brought with him. The children recoiled as if he'd offered them poison. They shook their heads vigorously, their green faces contorted in expressions of disgust. Thomas offered them some cheese, with the same result. It was clear they weren't interested in the food the villagers ate. Finally, Thomas noticed the boy eyeing the raw beans he carried in his pouch for his lunch. He offered a handful to the children. To their surprise, the children's eyes lit up. They snatched the beans from Thomas's hand and devoured them ravenously, as if they hadn't eaten in days. This discovery was a breakthrough. It was the only food they seemed willing to eat. Thomas and John, realizing they couldn't simply leave the children in the woods, decided to take them back to the village. They gently coaxed the children, offering them more beans as a form of enticement. The children, though still wary, seemed to understand that they were being offered help. They allowed themselves to be led out of the woods, their small green hands clutching the beans tightly. The villagers of Woolpit were stunned by the sight of the green children. News of their discovery spread like wildfire, drawing curious onlookers from neighboring hamlets. The children, bewildered and frightened by the crowd, clung to each other, their green skin a stark contrast against the pale faces of the villagers. Sir Richard de Conde, the local lord, was informed of the strange occurrence. He, being a man of some education and curiosity, ordered the children to be brought to his castle. He was intrigued by their unusual appearance and their strange language. He hoped to unravel the mystery of their origins. At the castle, the children were given food and shelter. However, their diet remained a peculiar one. They refused all food except raw beans. Anything else, even the finest bread and meat, was met with disgust and refusal. The villagers and the castle staff were perplexed. They had never encountered anything like it. Days turned into weeks, and the mystery of the green children deepened. They spoke to each other in their strange tongue, a language no one recognized. No one could understand where they came from or how they had ended up in the woods. The boy, unfortunately, was frail and sickly. Despite the care he received, he grew weaker and weaker. After a few short months, he succumbed to his illness and died. His death cast a pall over the castle and the village. The mystery surrounding the children seemed to grow darker, more ominous. The girl, however, survived. Slowly, over time, she began to adapt to her new surroundings. She gradually lost her green complexion, her skin returning to a more normal hue. She also began to learn the English language, though it was a slow and arduous process. At first, she communicated through gestures and simple words, but eventually, she learned to speak fluently. As she learned the language, she began to share her story, a tale so bizarre that it stretched the limits of belief. She claimed that she and her brother came from a place called St. Martin's Land, an underground world where everything was bathed in a perpetual twilight. The girl's story of St. Martin's Land was fantastical, a world unlike anything the villagers of Woolpit could have imagined. She described it as a subterranean realm, a place of perpetual twilight where the sun never shone. The light, she said, was a dim, greenish glow, filtering through the strange, subterranean vegetation. She spoke of rivers that flowed with a murky, green water and of strange, luminous plants that pulsed with an eerie light. According to the girl, the inhabitants of St. Martin's Land were all green-skinned, like herself and her brother. They lived in a large, underground city, though she couldn't describe its architecture in any detail, saying only that it was vast and filled with echoing caverns. She spoke of a societal structure, though her descriptions were vague, hinting at some form of hierarchy with rulers and commoners. She couldn't explain how she and her brother had come to be above ground, only that they had been following their flock. She used a word that sounded like flock, but no one could be sure what it meant, and somehow wandered into a cave. They became disoriented and eventually found themselves in the strange, bright world of Woolpit. The villagers, listening to her tale, were filled with a mixture of awe, disbelief, and fear. Some whispered that she was a changeling, a fairy child swapped for a human baby. Others believed she was a demon in disguise, sent to test their faith. Still others, more open-minded, wondered if she was telling the truth, a lost child from some unknown, hidden land. Sir Richard, intrigued by her story, had it recorded. He consulted with learned men, scholars, and clergymen, but none could offer an explanation. No one had ever heard of a subterranean world inhabited by green-skinned people. The girl's tale remained a mystery, a puzzle with no solution. As the girl grew older, she adapted to life in Woolpit. She learned to eat normal food, though she always retained a fondness for raw beans. She adopted the Christian faith and learned the customs and traditions of the village. She was given the name Agnes Bar. Agnes eventually married a man from the nearby village of Fornham St. Martin, and she lived a relatively normal life. She never fully forgot her origins, however, and she would occasionally speak of St. Martin's Land, her stories becoming more coherent and detailed as her command of the English language improved. She described the strange creatures that lived in her homeland, creatures that sounded like nothing on Earth. She spoke of flying creatures with leathery wings and of blind, pale fish that swam in the underground rivers. One of the most unsettling aspects of her story was her description of the light in St. Martin's Land. She insisted it wasn't like the light of the sun or the moon, but a cold, green luminescence that permeated everything. She said it was a living light, emanating from the plants and even the rocks themselves. This detail, more than any other, convinced some that her story was true. How could she have invented such a detail? How could she have known about bioluminescence, a phenomenon that was not widely understood at the time? Despite her integration into village life, Agnes remained an enigma. She was a woman caught between two worlds, the familiar world of Woolpit and the strange, otherworldly realm of St. Martin's Land. She was a living testament to the unknown, a reminder that there were still mysteries beyond the comprehension of even the most learned men. The Bell Witch. The year is 1817. Adams, Tennessee, is a quiet, unassuming place, nestled amidst rolling hills and dense forests. John Bell Sr., a hardworking farmer, had settled here with his wife, Lucy, and their children, drawn by the fertile land and the promise of a peaceful life. They built a sturdy farmhouse, raised their crops, and became respected members of the small community. For a time, life was good, but the peace was about to be shattered. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. Strange rustling noises in the attic at night, the unexplained movement of objects, a chair slightly out of place, a tool moved from the barn to the porch. At first, the Bells dismissed these occurrences as their imaginations, the creaking of an old house, or the mischief of nocturnal animals. But the incidents grew more frequent, more pronounced. Doors would creak open and slam, shut with no draft to explain it. Footsteps echoed on the stairs when no one was there. Whispers, barely audible, seemed to emanate from the corners of rooms, too indistinct to understand, yet undeniably present. One evening, as the family gathered for supper, a series of sharp raps echoed through the house, seemingly coming from the walls themselves. The children, Betsy, Richard, and John Jr., were terrified. Even John Sr., a man of considerable fortitude, felt a prickle of unease. He searched the house thoroughly, but found no explanation for the noises. The rapping continued intermittently for days, sometimes loud and insistent, sometimes soft and subtle, always unnervingly close. Then came the voices. Not human voices, not exactly. They were more like whispers, disembodied and ethereal, murmuring just at the edge of hearing. At first, they were unintelligible, a low, constant drone. But as the days turned into weeks, the whispers began to form words, then sentences. They spoke of the Bells, of their lives, their secrets. They mocked them, taunted them, and sometimes threatened them. The voice, when it became clearer, was often described as a high-pitched, raspy cackle, sometimes masculine, sometimes feminine, but always malevolent. It seemed to be everywhere at once, coming from the walls, the ceiling, even from beneath the floorboards. It was relentless, invasive, and utterly terrifying. Betsy Bell, the youngest daughter, seemed to be the focal point of the entity's attention. The voice would often call her name, sometimes sweetly, sometimes with a snarl. It would follow her throughout the house, whispering obscenities and making cruel remarks about her appearance and her friendships. Sometimes, the whispers would escalate into physical attacks. Betsy would be pinched, slapped, and even pulled by her hair, leaving visible marks on her skin. The family witnessed these attacks, yet they could see no one, no thing, responsible. John Bell Sr., a man of logic and reason, tried desperately to find a rational explanation for the haunting. He examined the house from top to bottom, searching for hidden passages, loose floorboards, anything that could explain the strange phenomena. He consulted with neighbors, but no one had experienced anything similar. He even sought the advice of a local doctor, who could offer no medical explanation for Betsy's bruises and scratches. The haunting intensified. The voice became louder, more aggressive. It would interrupt conversations, make pronouncements, and even predict future events, some of which, disturbingly, came to pass. The entity claimed to be a witch, and the locals began to whisper about the Bell Witch. Fear gripped the community. People avoided the Bell farm after dark, and rumors spread like wildfire about the malevolent spirit that had taken up residence there. The family's life had become a living nightmare. Sleep offered no respite, as the entity would often torment them in their dreams, its whispers echoing in their minds even as they slept. The once happy, bustling farmhouse had become a place of dread, a prison haunted by an unseen tormentor. The Bells were trapped, caught in a terrifying reality they could not understand, let alone escape. The Bell Witch's reign of terror continued unabated. The family was isolated, shunned by their neighbors who feared the entity's wrath. John Bell Sr., a man of strong faith, clung to his religion, but even his prayers seemed to go unanswered. The entity taunted him, mocking his beliefs and promising him eternal damnation. One night, as John lay in bed, unable to sleep, he heard the voice whisper, "You will die." A chill ran down his spine, but he tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just a trick of the mind. However, the following morning, he woke up feeling unwell. His stomach churned, his head ached, and his body ached all over. He suspected he had been poisoned. Over the next few days, John's condition worsened. He became delirious, hallucinating, and his body wasted away before their eyes. The doctor was baffled, unable to diagnose his illness. The family watched helplessly as their father's health deteriorated, the entity's voice growing louder and more triumphant with each passing day. On the night of John's death, the house was filled with a cacophony of sounds, screams, laughter, and the relentless whispering of the entity. John's family huddled together in the parlor, their hearts heavy with grief. Suddenly, the voice rang out, "John Bell is dead. I killed him. I killed him." The family gasped in horror as John's body convulsed, then went still. The death of John Bell did not end the haunting. The entity, now more brazen than ever, continued to torment the family, especially Betsy, who remained the primary target of its abuse. The voice would often taunt her with John's death, claiming that she had been the cause of it. Betsy, already traumatized by the years of torment, was driven to the brink of madness. The community was in a state of panic. People feared that the Bell Witch had been unleashed and that her curse would spread to other families. Some even suggested burning the Bell farm to the ground, believing it was the only way to rid themselves of the evil spirit. Despite the fear and superstition, the Bells remained in their home, determined to resist the entity's terror. They sought solace in their faith, praying for deliverance and for the strength to endure. But the haunting continued, unrelenting and merciless. One day, a traveling preacher named Benjamin Winchester arrived in Adams. He had heard of the Bell Witch haunting Anne. Believing himself to be a man of God, he offered his help. He agreed to stay with the Bells and perform an exorcism to rid the house of the evil spirit. The exorcism was a long and arduous ordeal. For days, Winchester and the Bells prayed, chanted, and fasted, hoping to drive out the entity. At times, the house would be filled with a deafening cacophony of sounds, as if the entity were fighting back. But the Bells held on, their faith unwavering. Finally, on the seventh day, the exorcism reached its climax. Winchester, his voice raised in prayer, commanded the entity to leave the house and return to the depths of hell from whence it came. The entity, sensing its defeat, let out a blood-curdling scream and vanished, leaving behind a trail of sulfurous smoke. The house was silent, eerily so. The Bells, exhausted but relieved, embraced each other, thanking God for their deliverance. The haunting was over, at least for now. However, the Bell Witch's curse was not broken. The entity, though banished, remained in the area, lurking in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to return. And even though the Bells eventually moved away, the legend of the Bell Witch continued to haunt Adams, a chilling reminder of the supernatural forces that can invade our world. The Bennington Triangle. The crisp Vermont air, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, did little to soothe Sarah's frayed nerves. October in Bennington was beautiful. A tapestry of crimson and gold splashed across the rolling hills, but it also carried a chill that seeped deeper than the temperature. She'd lived here her whole life, had hiked these trails countless times, yet lately, an unease had settled over her, a prickling sensation of being watched. It had started subtly, a branch snapping when there was no wind, the feeling of eyes on her back even when she knew she was alone. Then came the stories, whispers in the local diner about the disappearances. 5 people, gone without a trace, swallowed by the Green Mountain wilderness. The most chilling was the story of the woman who vanished on a clear afternoon, walking between her husband and a friend. One moment she was there, the next, simply gone. No scream, no struggle, just an empty space where she'd been. Sarah dismissed them as folklore, tales spun to spook tourists during the leaf-peeping season. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing day. Today, she decided to hike to Glastonbury Mountain, a place locals whispered about with a mixture of awe and fear. It was the heart of the so-called Bennington Triangle, the epicenter of the disappearances. She wanted to see it for herself, to confront her unease. She parked her Jeep at the trailhead, a small clearing off a winding dirt road. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the rustling leaves and the distant caw of a crow. The trail was narrow, winding through a dense forest of maple and birch. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, dappling the forest floor in an eerie light. As she walked, Sarah tried to rationalize her fear. It was just the isolation, the vastness of the woods. Nothing to be afraid of. But the stories kept creeping into her mind. The hiker who vanished from a well-marked trail. The elderly man who disappeared while hunting near his home. The college student who was never seen again after a day hike. All of them vanished without a trace, leaving behind only unanswered questions and a growing sense of dread. She reached a small stream, its water icy cold and clear. She paused, taking a sip from her water bottle. The air here felt different, heavier, charged with something she couldn't explain. She looked around, scanning the trees, half expecting to see something, someone, watching her. But there was nothing, just the silent woods. As she continued her hike, the trail began to climb steeply, leading her deeper into the heart of the mountain. The trees grew taller, their branches gnarled and twisted, forming a dark and imposing canopy overhead. The sunlight faded, replaced by an eerie twilight. The feeling of being watched intensified, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She noticed a small, unmarked path branching off the main trail. It was overgrown, barely visible, but something about it drew her in. She hesitated for a moment, then decided to follow it. It couldn't be any worse than the main trail, right? The path led her through a thick undergrowth, the branches scratching at her clothes. The air grew colder, the silence more profound. She felt a growing sense of disorientation, as if she were losing her way. She stopped, trying to get her bearings. The trees seemed to press in on her, their dark shapes looming in the dim light. Then, she saw it. A flicker of movement in the shadows, a fleeting glimpse of something. Human? She couldn't be sure. It was gone in an instant, leaving her heart pounding in her chest. She strained her eyes, trying to see through the gloom, but there was nothing. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. Only the silence answered her. She told herself it was just her imagination, the product of her overwrought nerves. But the feeling of being watched persisted, growing stronger with each passing moment. She felt as if she were being hunted, stalked by something unseen, something malevolent. She decided to turn back, to return to the main trail. But as she turned, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Standing in the shadows, just a few feet away, was a figure. It was tall and gaunt, its features obscured by the darkness. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching her. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. She took a step back, then another, her eyes fixed on the figure. It didn't follow her, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching her, its presence radiating an aura of pure evil. She turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't look back, didn't dare to. She ran as fast as she could, her lungs burning, her legs aching. She didn't stop running until she reached the main trail, until she saw the familiar markers that led back to the trailhead. When she finally reached her Jeep, she didn't stop to catch her breath. She jumped in, started the engine, and sped away, leaving the dark woods behind her. She didn't stop until she reached the town of Bennington, until she saw the lights of the diner, the familiar faces of the locals. She pulled into the diner's parking lot, her hands still shaking. She went inside, ordered a cup of coffee, and tried to calm her nerves. She told herself it was just her imagination, that she'd let the stories get to her. But deep down, she knew she'd seen something in the woods, something that wasn't human, something that was waiting, watching, in the heart of the Bennington Triangle. The Charles Morgan Mystery. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly, baking the cracked earth and shimmering off the hood of Charles Morgan's Cadillac. He squinted, adjusting his sunglasses, a bead of sweat trickling down his temple. He was a man of routine, of schedules, of deals. This detour, driving out to a remote patch of desert to look at a potential land investment, was already making him uneasy. The land was cheap, ridiculously so, but the real estate agent, a shifty-eyed man named Frank, had been insistent. "Trust me, Mr. Morgan," Frank had said, his voice greasy with insincerity. "This is a gold mine." Charles, a shrewd businessman, wasn't one to trust easily. He'd built his successful construction firm from the ground up, and gut instinct was as important to him as any financial statement. And his gut was screaming at him to turn around. The landscape was desolate, nothing but scrub brush and red rock formations that looked like gnarled, skeletal fingers reaching out of the earth. Even the air felt heavy, charged with something he couldn't quite place. Frank had promised the site was just another mile down a barely there dirt track. Charles checked his watch. He was already running late for a meeting with his project manager. He almost decided to call it quits, but the lure of a potentially lucrative deal, the kind that could catapult his company to the next level, kept him going. Finally, Frank's beat-up pickup truck came into view, parked haphazardly near a cluster of Joshua trees. Frank was leaning against the truck, smoking a cigarette, his face obscured by the shadow of his cowboy hat. He didn't wave, didn't smile. He just flicked the cigarette, but into the dirt and waited. Charles pulled up, the Cadillac's tires crunching on the gravel. He switched off the engine, the sudden silence amplifying the oppressive stillness of the desert. He stepped out of the car, the heat hitting him like a wall. "Mr. Morgan," Frank drawled, tipping his hat. "Glad you could make it." "Let's get this over with, Frank," Charles said, trying to keep the impatience out of his voice. "I'm on a tight schedule." Frank chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Time's a funny thing out here, Mr. Morgan. Seems to stretch and bend, sometimes even disappear." Charles frowned. He didn't like Frank's tone. He didn't like the way Frank's eyes, hidden in the shadows of his hat, seemed to gleam with an unsettling light. "The property's this way," Frank said, gesturing towards the barren landscape. "Just a short walk." Charles hesitated. He looked back at his car, a beacon of civilization in this desolate expanse. He thought about getting back in, driving away, forgetting the whole thing. But the image of the potential profit, the expansion of his company, flashed in his mind. He sighed. "All right, let's go." They walked in silence for what felt like an eternity. The sun beat down relentlessly, and the air grew thick with a strange, metallic scent. Charles felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, as if he were being watched. He glanced around, but saw nothing but the endless desert. Frank stopped abruptly. "Here we are," he said. Charles looked around. There was nothing there, just more scrub brush, more red rock, more empty space. "Where?" Charles asked, his voice tight. Frank grinned, a wide, unsettling grin that revealed yellowed teeth. "Right here, Mr. Morgan, right where you're standing." Charles felt a chill run down his spine, despite the oppressive heat. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had made a terrible mistake. He turned to face Frank, ready to demand an explanation, ready to get back to his car, back to safety, but Frank was gone. Charles blinked, his heart pounding in his chest. He scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of the real estate agent, but there was nothing, just the endless, silent desert. He called out Frank's name, his voice echoing eerily in the stillness. No answer. He felt a wave of panic wash over him. He was alone, stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no phone signal and no idea where Frank had gone. He started to walk back towards where he thought he'd parked the car, but the landscape seemed to have shifted, the familiar landmarks replaced by an endless expanse of identical scrub brush and rock formations. He was lost. The sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the desert. The temperature plummeted, and a cold wind whipped across the barren landscape. Charles shivered, his fear growing with each passing moment. He walked for hours, stumbling through the darkness, his shoes filling with sand, his throat parched. He called out for Frank again and again, but his voice was swallowed by the silence. Finally, exhausted and dehydrated, he collapsed onto the ground, his body trembling. He looked up at the star-studded sky, a vast, indifferent expanse that offered no comfort. He had no idea how long he lay there, lost in his fear and despair. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind filled with fragmented images, distorted memories, and a growing sense of dread. Then, he saw something, a flicker of light in the distance. He strained his eyes, trying to make out what it was. The light grew brighter, closer, until it resolved itself into the headlights of a vehicle. With a surge of adrenaline, Charles struggled to his feet and waved his arms frantically. The vehicle slowed down, then stopped. A figure emerged from the darkness. It was Frank. Charles felt a wave of relief so intense that he almost wept. He rushed towards Frank, ready to unleash his anger, his fear, his frustration. But as he got closer, he saw that something was wrong. Frank's eyes were vacant, his face pale and drawn. He moved with a strange, jerky motion, like a puppet on strings. And then, Charles saw the glint of metal in Frank's hand. A gun. Frank raised the gun, pointing it directly at Charles's head. Charles froze, his blood running cold. "You shouldn't have come out here, Mr. Morgan," Frank said, his voice flat and emotionless. "This is our land now." Charles stared at Frank, his mind reeling. "What are you talking about?" he stammered. Frank didn't answer. He simply tightened his grip on the gun and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the stillness of the desert. Charles Morgan fell to the ground, his lifeblood staining the sand. Frank stood over him for a moment, then turned and walked back to his truck, disappearing into the darkness. The desert reclaimed its silence. The stars continued to shine, indifferent to the drama that had just unfolded beneath them. Charles Morgan was gone, swallowed by the vast, unforgiving landscape. His disappearance would become a mystery, a puzzle with missing pieces, a chilling reminder of the secrets that lie hidden beneath the Arizona sun. Days passed. Charles Morgan was officially declared missing. His wife, Elizabeth, was frantic, her hope dwindling with each passing hour. The police investigation went nowhere. Frank, when questioned, played the part of the helpful real estate agent, claiming he'd shown Morgan the property, and the man had simply driven off afterwards. There was no evidence to suggest otherwise. The desolate landscape offered no clues, no witnesses. It had swallowed Charles Morgan whole. Then, he reappeared. It was late at night, almost a week after his disappearance. Elizabeth was sitting in the living room, staring at a framed photo of Charles, tears streaming down her face. She had just accepted the grim reality that he was likely gone, lost forever in the unforgiving desert. Suddenly, she heard a noise, a faint scratching at the back door. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She held her breath, listening intently. The scratching came again, more insistent this time. Hesitantly, she got up and walked towards the door. She peered through the peephole. What she saw made her gasp. It was Charles. He was standing on the porch, his clothes torn and dirty, his face gaunt and pale. He looked disoriented, confused, like a man who had wandered in from another world. He was wearing something strange, something that looked like a bulletproof vest. Elizabeth fumbled with the lock, her hands shaking. She threw open the door and Charles stumbled into the house. collapsing into her arms. "Charles, where have you been?" she cried, her voice choked with emotion. He looked at her, his eyes unfocused, as if he didn't recognize her. They poisoned me," he mumbled, his voice weak and raspy. "Who poisoned you? What happened?" Elizabeth asked, her mind racing. Charles shook his head, his brow furrowed. I don't know. I can't remember. Just poisoned." Elizabeth helped him inside, noticing the strange vest he was wearing. "What is this?" she asked, touching the thick material. "Protection," Charles whispered. "Needed protection." Elizabeth was bewildered. She didn't understand what he was talking about. All she knew was that he was back, alive, and that was all that mattered. She got him into bed, cleaned his wounds, and tried to piece together what had happened. But Charles was unable to give her any coherent answers. His memory was fragmented, filled with gaps and inconsistencies. He kept repeating the same phrases: poisoned, protection, they're watching. The police came to the house the next morning. They questioned Charles, but he couldn't provide any useful information. He was clearly traumatized, confused, and unable to recall the events of the past week. The police were suspicious, but there was nothing they could do. They filed a report and left, leaving Elizabeth with more questions than answers. Over the next few days, Charles seemed to be slowly recovering. He regained some of his memory, but the details of his disappearance remained shrouded in mystery. He couldn't explain how he had survived in the desert for so long, how he had gotten the bulletproof vest, or who had tried to poison him. He just kept saying that he felt like he had been through something terrible, something he couldn't comprehend. He was also strangely paranoid. He kept looking over his shoulder, as if he were being watched. He refused to go outside, and he insisted on keeping the doors and windows locked at all times. He told Elizabeth that they were after him, but he couldn't explain who they were or what they wanted. Elizabeth was worried. She could see that Charles was deeply disturbed, that something had happened to him out in the desert, something that had fundamentally changed him. She tried to get him to talk about it, but he just clammed up, his eyes filled with fear. Then, he vanished again. It was just like before. He went to bed one night, and in the morning, he was gone. The only difference was that this time, he took the bulletproof vest with him. Elizabeth was devastated. She knew, deep down, that this time, he wasn't coming back. She called the police, but they were dismissive, suggesting that Charles had simply run off. But Elizabeth knew better. She knew that something sinister had happened, something that the police were either unwilling or unable to investigate. She decided to take matters into her own hands. She went back to the real estate office and demanded to speak to Frank. He denied any involvement in Charles's disappearance, but Elizabeth could see the fear in his eyes. She knew he was hiding something. She tried to follow him, but he was too elusive. He seemed to always be one step ahead of her. She felt like she was being watched, that someone was following her, keeping track of her movements. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. There was no sign of Charles. Elizabeth never gave up hope, but she knew that the chances of finding him alive were slim. Then, she received a phone call. It was from the police. They had found a body in the desert. It was Charles. He had been shot in the back of the head. The discovery of Charles Morgan's body sent shockwaves through the community. The circumstances were bizarre, to say the least. He was found in a remote area of the desert, miles from any road, wearing the same bulletproof vest he had vanished with. The gunshot wound to the back of the head was, according to the coroner, instantly fatal. But the police, despite the obvious signs of foul play, were quick to declare it a suicide. They pointed to the lack of any other suspects, the remoteness of the location, and Charles's previous erratic behavior as evidence. The case was closed, another unsolved mystery filed away in the annals of Arizona law enforcement. Elizabeth, however, refused to accept this explanation. She knew Charles, and she knew he wouldn't take his own life. She was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how difficult or dangerous it might be. She started by going through Charles's belongings, searching for any clue that might shed light on his disappearance and death. She found his briefcase, locked as usual. She managed to break it open, her hands trembling with anticipation. Inside, she found a collection of strange and unsettling items. There was a notebook filled with cryptic symbols and coded messages, a map with several locations marked with red ink, and a small, sealed envelope. Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest. She felt like she was on the verge of uncovering something big, something dangerous. She carefully examined the notebook, trying to decipher the symbols. She recognized some of them as mathematical equations, others as astronomical charts, and still others as ancient hieroglyphs. It was a bewildering mix of information, seemingly unrelated and yet somehow connected. She opened the envelope, her fingers shaking. Inside, she found a single sheet of paper, folded carefully. She unfolded it, her eyes widening in disbelief. It was a letter addressed to Charles. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words were chilling. The truth is out there, Charles, but it's not what you think. You've stumbled upon something you shouldn't have, something that powerful people want to keep hidden. They'll stop at nothing to protect their secrets. Be careful. Trust no one. And remember, the desert keeps its secrets well. Elizabeth's blood ran cold. She realized that Charles had been involved in something far bigger and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. He had uncovered something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden, and they had killed him to silence him. But what was it that he had discovered? What secrets were so important that they were willing to murder to protect them? Elizabeth was determined to find out. She started by researching the locations marked on the map. She discovered that they were all government facilities, some of them top secret, involved in classified research and development. She began to suspect that Charles had stumbled upon some kind of conspiracy, something that went far beyond his construction business. She tried to contact the authorities, but they were dismissive, telling her that she was wasting their time. She realized that she was on her own. She decided to visit the locations on the map, hoping to find some answers. She started with the closest one, a sprawling complex surrounded by barbed wire fences and guarded by armed personnel. She tried to get inside, but she was quickly apprehended and interrogated. They accused her of trespassing and espionage and threatened to arrest her if she didn't leave. Elizabeth was undeterred. She knew she was close to the truth, and she wouldn't give up until she found it. She continued to visit the other locations on the map, each time encountering resistance and hostility. She was followed, harassed, and threatened. She realized that she was putting herself in danger, but she couldn't stop. She owed it to Charles to find out what had happened to him. One day, she received a package in the mail. It was a small, plain box with no return address. She opened it cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, she found a single item, Charles's bulletproof vest. It was stained with blood. Elizabeth gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She recognized the blood. It was Charles's. She realized that the message was clear. They were warning her. They were telling her to stop digging, to leave the past alone, or she would suffer the same fate as Charles. Elizabeth was terrified, but she was also more determined than ever. She knew that she couldn't let them win. She had to find out the truth, no matter the cost. She continued her investigation, piecing together the clues, following the leads, and dodging the threats. She learned about secret government projects, about illegal experiments, about conspiracies that went to the highest levels of power. She discovered that Charles had been working on a construction project for one of the government facilities on the map. He had accidentally uncovered something he shouldn't have, something that exposed the dark underbelly of the government's clandestine operations. He had tried to tell someone, to expose the truth, but they had silenced him. They had poisoned him, kidnapped him, and ultimately killed him. Elizabeth knew that she was the only one who could bring them to justice. She had to find a way to expose their secrets, to reveal the truth to the world. But she was running out of time. They were closing in on her, their patience wearing thin. She knew that she had to act fast, before it was too late. She decided to go public with her story. She contacted a journalist, a woman known for her investigative reporting and her fearless pursuit of the truth. She told her everything. About Charles's disappearance, about the cryptic note, about the hidden messages, about the government secrets. The journalist was skeptical at first, but Elizabeth's conviction and the evidence she presented were compelling. She agreed to help Elizabeth expose the truth. They worked together, gathering information, interviewing witnesses, and piecing together the puzzle. They faced obstacles and threats, but they persevered. Finally, they were ready. They published their story, a bombshell expose that revealed the government's dark secrets and the lengths they had gone to protect them. The public outcry was immediate and overwhelming. The government was forced to launch an investigation, and the people involved in the conspiracy were arrested and prosecuted. Elizabeth had finally achieved justice for Charles. She had exposed the truth, and she had brought down the powerful people who had tried to silence him. But the story didn't end there. The desert still held its secrets, and there were still those who wanted to keep them hidden. Elizabeth knew that her fight wasn't over, that she would always have to be vigilant, always have to be ready to defend the truth. She had learned that the truth was a powerful weapon, and she would use it to protect herself, her loved ones, and the memory of Charles Morgan, the man who had dared to uncover the secrets of the Arizona desert. The hum of Taos. The high desert air of Taos, New Mexico, hung heavy and still, even as the sun dipped below the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple. For Sarah, a recent transplant to the area, the beauty was undeniable, a stark contrast to the bustling city life she'd left behind. Yet, beneath the surface of tranquility, a disquieting hum vibrated, a low-frequency thrumming that seemed to emanate not from the air, but from the very ground beneath her feet. Sarah had first noticed it a few weeks after moving into her small adobe house on the outskirts of town. At first, she dismissed it as the rumble of distant traffic, or perhaps the wind whistling through the canyons. But the hum persisted, a constant, almost subliminal presence that burrowed into her consciousness. It wasn't loud, not exactly, more like a vibration, a pressure against her eardrums that sometimes made her teeth ache. She'd started researching, a habit ingrained from her days as a journalist. Local chat forums were filled with similar accounts. People called it the Taos hum. Some described it as a deep, resonant drone, others as a rhythmic pulsing. The common thread was its persistence and its unsettling effect. Headaches, nausea, insomnia, a pervasive feeling of anxiety. These were the common complaints. A few even spoke of something more sinister, a sense of being watched, an oppressive dread that settled over them like a shroud. Sarah, a woman of science and logic, initially scoffed at the more outlandish theories. Secret government experiments, underground alien bases, ancient, slumbering entities, it all sounded like fodder for late-night radio shows. Yet, the sheer number of people reporting the same phenomena, the genuine fear in their voices, gave her pause. She tried to record the hum, but her digital recorder picked up nothing but the ambient sounds of the desert night. It was as if the hum existed only in the perception of those who heard it, a phantom vibration that bypassed conventional recording devices. One evening, while browsing the local library's archives, Sarah stumbled upon an old newspaper article from the 1950s. It mentioned a series of strange occurrences in the Taos area, livestock behaving erratically, reports of unusual lights in the sky, and whispers of a strange, unsettling sound. The article attributed it to atmospheric anomalies and quickly dismissed it. But something about the tone, the almost hushed way the reporter described the sound, sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. It was the same sound, she realized, the same pervasive hum that was now driving her to the brink of obsession. The feeling of being watched intensified. It wasn't a visual sensation, not exactly. It was more like a prickling on the back of her neck, a constant awareness that something was observing her from the shadows. She'd find herself glancing out the windows, scanning the empty desert landscape, but there was never anything there. Just the vast, silent expanse and the ever-present hum. Sleep became a battleground. As soon as she closed her eyes, the hum would amplify, morphing into a rhythmic pounding in her skull. Vivid nightmares plagued her, shadowy figures lurking in the corners of her room, whispers in an unknown language, and the constant, oppressive feeling of being trapped. She tried earplugs, white noise machines, even prescription sleeping pills, but nothing worked. The hum was always there, a constant reminder of something unseen, something unknown, something that was slowly eroding her sanity. One night, Sarah decided to venture out into the desert. She told herself it was research, a way to try and pinpoint the source of the hum. But deep down, she knew it was something more, a desperate attempt to confront the fear that was consuming her. Armed with a flashlight and a compass, she drove out into the vast emptiness, the hum growing louder with each mile she put between herself and the town. She parked her car on a deserted dirt road and stepped out into the stillness. The stars blazed overhead, a million pinpricks of light against the inky black canvas of the night sky. The air was crisp and cold, and the silence was almost deafening, broken only by the faint hum that vibrated through the ground. Sarah walked away from the road, her flashlight beam dancing across the scrub brush and the rocky terrain. The feeling of being watched intensified, making the hairs on her arms stand on end. She stopped and scanned the horizon, her heart pounding in her chest. There was nothing there, just the endless desert and the silent stars. Then, she heard it, a whisper, faint, almost inaudible, but definitely there. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a sibilant sound that slithered into her mind. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, ancient, malevolent, and utterly terrifying. Sarah stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat. She fumbled for her car keys, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She had to get out of there. She had to escape the hum, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. As she turned to run, her flashlight beam caught something in the distance. A figure, standing silhouetted against the starlight. It was tall and gaunt, its features obscured by the darkness. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching her. Sarah screamed, a primal sound of pure terror that was swallowed by the vastness of the desert. She ran, her feet pounding against the hard-packed earth, the whisper echoing in her ears, growing louder, closer. She didn't look back. She didn't dare. She just ran, driven by a fear so profound that it threatened to shatter her soul. Sarah didn't stop running until she reached her car. She fumbled with the keys, her hands still shaking so violently she could barely insert them into the ignition. The engine sputtered to life, and she slammed her foot on the gas pedal, the tires spitting gravel as she sped away from the desolate expanse of the desert. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The image of that figure, standing silently in the starlight, was burned into her mind, a chilling reminder of the terror she had experienced. Back in her adobe house, Sarah locked all the doors and windows, even though she knew it wouldn't do any good. The fear had burrowed deep, settling in her bones like a cold, malignant presence. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that something was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. Sleep was impossible. She lay in bed, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum that vibrated through the walls. The whisper still echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder of the ancient, malevolent presence she had encountered in the desert. She felt utterly vulnerable, exposed, as if the very walls of her house were no barrier against the unseen forces that were closing in on her. The next morning, Sarah decided she needed answers. She couldn't continue living like this, consumed by fear and paranoia. She went to the Taos Public Library, hoping to find some information about the figure she had seen in the desert, some explanation for the strange occurrences that were plaguing her. She spent hours poring over old newspapers, historical documents, and local folklore. She found several accounts of similar sightings, shadowy figures, strange lights in the sky, and whispers in the desert. Some of the stories dated back centuries, passed down through generations of Native American families. One particular story caught her attention. It was a legend about a malevolent spirit that dwelled in the desert, a creature of darkness that fed on fear and despair. The legend described the spirit as a tall, gaunt figure, often seen silhouetted against the starlight, its features obscured by shadows. The Native Americans called it the Walker in the Night. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The description matched perfectly the figure she had seen in the desert. Could it be true? Could this ancient legend be the key to understanding the terror that was haunting her? She decided to seek out a local historian, someone who might know more about the legends and folklore of the Taos area. She found a woman named Elena Montoya, who was known for her extensive knowledge of Native American history and traditions. Elena was a kind, elderly woman with a warm smile and piercing eyes. She listened patiently as Sarah recounted her experiences, her voice trembling with fear and exhaustion. When Sarah finished, Elena nodded slowly, her expression grave. "The Walker in the Night," she said softly. "He is an ancient spirit, a creature of darkness that has been here since long before the Spanish arrived. He feeds on fear, on despair. He is drawn to places of great sorrow, places where the veil between worlds is thin." "And the hum?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What about the hum?" "The hum," Elena explained, "is the sound of his approach. It is the vibration of his presence in our world. It is a warning." Sarah felt a wave of despair wash over her. A warning? What did it mean? What was she supposed to do? "Is there any way to stop him?" she asked, her voice filled with desperation. Elena looked at her with a mixture of pity and resolve. "There are ways," she said, "but they are not easy. The Walker in the Night is powerful. He has been here for centuries, feeding on the fear of generations. To defeat him, you must confront your own fear, your own darkness. You must find the strength within yourself to stand against him." Elena told Sarah about ancient rituals passed down through generations of Native American healers, rituals that could banish the Walker in the Night back to the realm of darkness. But she warned Sarah that the rituals were dangerous, that they required courage and unwavering faith. Sarah left Elena's house feeling a glimmer of hope, but also a profound sense of dread. She knew that confronting the Walker in the Night would be the most terrifying thing she had ever done. But she also knew that she had no choice. She couldn't continue living in fear. She had to find the strength within herself to fight back. She spent the next few days researching the ancient rituals, studying the symbols and the chants, preparing herself for the confrontation that was to come. She knew it wouldn't be easy. The Walker in the Night was a creature of darkness, and it would not give up its hold on her easily. As the days passed, the hum grew louder, the whispers more frequent. Sarah felt the presence of the Walker in the Night growing stronger, closing in on her. She knew that the time was coming, that she would soon have to face her fears and confront the ancient evil that was haunting her. She just hoped she was strong enough to survive. The night of the ritual arrived, cloaked in an unnerving stillness. The hum had reached a fever pitch, a constant, throbbing pressure against Sarah's skull. The whispers were no longer faint. They slithered through her mind, forming words she couldn't understand, yet somehow knew were laced with malice. Fear gnawed at her, a cold, sharp ache in her gut. But beneath the fear, a flicker of resolve burned. She had come too far to turn back now. Following Elena's instructions, Sarah had prepared her small adobe house. The windows were covered with blankets, blocking out the starlight, creating a small sanctuary of darkness within the larger darkness that had enveloped Taos. In the center of the room, she had drawn a circle on the earthen floor, using white cornmeal as Elena had instructed. Inside the circle, she placed a small clay bowl filled with water, a symbol of purity and life. Around the bowl, she arranged 4 candles, representing the 4 directions, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. She had gathered the other items Elena had prescribed: sage to cleanse the space, cedar to ward off evil spirits, and a piece of turquoise, a sacred stone believed to possess protective powers. She clutched the turquoise tightly in her hand, drawing strength from its smooth, cool surface. Taking a deep breath, Sarah lit the sage, allowing its pungent smoke to fill the room, cleansing it of negative energy. She walked around the circle, letting the smoke wash over her, feeling a slight sense of calm settle over her. Then, she lit the cedar, its sweet, earthy aroma mingling with the sage. The combined scents created a sacred atmosphere, a space set apart from the encroaching darkness. Sarah stood at the edge of the circle, her heart pounding in her chest. She closed her eyes, took another deep breath, and began to chant the ancient words Elena had taught her. The words were in a language she didn't understand, yet they resonated within her, stirring something deep within her soul. As she chanted, she felt a strange energy building within the circle, a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The hum intensified, vibrating through the floor, through her bones. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her, taunting her, trying to break her concentration. She could feel the presence of the walker in the night, lurking just beyond the circle, its malevolent gaze fixed upon her. Suddenly, the candles flickered violently, threatening to extinguish. The shadows on the walls danced and writhed, taking on grotesque shapes. Sarah's fear threatened to overwhelm her. She almost faltered, almost gave in to the terror. But then, she remembered Elena's words: "You must confront your own fear, your own darkness." She opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames. She saw her own fear reflected in their dance, her own vulnerability laid bare. But she also saw something else, a spark of defiance, a flicker of courage that she hadn't known she possessed. She took another deep breath and continued chanting, her voice stronger now, more resolute. She focused on the turquoise in her hand, drawing strength from its protective power. She visualized a shield of light surrounding her, a barrier against the encroaching darkness. As she chanted, the room grew colder. A gust of wind swept through the house, rattling the windows, even though they were tightly closed. The whispers intensified, becoming clearer now, forming words she could understand. They were filled with hatred, with malice, with a promise of pain. "Leave this place," the whispers hissed. "You cannot defeat me. I am ancient. I am powerful. I will consume you." Sarah didn't respond. She continued chanting, her voice unwavering. She knew that the walker in the night was trying to intimidate her, trying to break her resolve, but she wouldn't give in. She wouldn't let fear control her. The candles flickered again, almost going out. The shadows writhed and twisted, forming a grotesque figure in the corner of the room. Sarah could feel the presence of the walker in the night, closer now, almost within reach. But then, something shifted. As Sarah continued chanting, the energy within the circle began to change. The darkness seemed to recede. The coldness began to dissipate. The whispers faded, becoming fainter, less distinct. The candles flickered one last time, then burned brightly, their flames steady and strong. The shadows retreated, disappearing back into the corners of the room. The grotesque figure vanished. Sarah opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on the center of the circle. The hum had subsided, replaced by an almost deafening silence. The whispers were gone. The presence of the walker in the night had vanished. She had faced her fear, confronted the darkness within herself, and emerged victorious. The ritual had worked. For now, at least, the walker in the night had been banished. Exhausted but filled with a sense of profound relief, Sarah extinguished the candles, one by one. She felt drained, but also strangely at peace. The fear was still there, lurking in the shadows, but it no longer held the same power over her. She knew that the walker in the night would return. It was only a matter of time, but she also knew that she would be ready. She had faced him once, and she would face him again, armed with the strength she had found within herself. The 3 a.m. phone calls. The old Victorian house on Linden Street seemed to sigh in the wind, its aged timbers groaning a mournful tune. Sarah had always loved its quirky charm, the creaky floorboards, the stained glass windows that cast rainbows across the dusty rooms. It felt like a home with a history, a place where stories whispered from the walls. She'd bought it cheaply, a steal in the desirable Westfield, New Jersey neighborhood, chalking up the low price to its slightly dilapidated state. She was young, single, eager to put down roots. She didn't mind a little work. The first few months were bliss. Sarah busied herself with renovations, painting the peeling woodwork, tending the overgrown garden. The house, she felt, was slowly coming back to life under her care. But then, the calls started. Precisely at 3 a.m., the shrill ring of the landline cut through the silence. Sarah, usually a sound sleeper, would jolt awake, her heart pounding. She'd fumble for the receiver, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. "Hello?" she'd whisper, her voice thick with sleep. There was no response, only a heavy, ragged breathing on the other end, like someone struggling for air. And beneath it, a faint, almost imperceptible whispering, too distant to understand, like the murmur of a crowd far away. The hair on the back of her neck would prickle. She'd hang up, her hand trembling, and pull the covers over her head, trying to block out the unsettling sounds. At first, she dismissed it as a wrong number, a prank call. But the calls persisted every single night, always at the same ungodly hour. The heavy breathing became more pronounced, sometimes interspersed with a low, guttural moan. The whispering, though still indistinct, seemed to grow closer, more insistent. Sarah started to dread the sound of the phone ringing. Sleep became a luxury she could no longer afford. She'd lie awake, her eyes wide in the darkness, listening for the telltale ring, her nerves stretched taut. She tried everything. She unplugged the phone at night, only to find it plugged back in the next morning. She called the phone company, but they could find no trace of the calls, no number, no origin. The caller ID displayed only the word unknown. It was as if the calls were coming from nowhere, from thin air. The whispering began to infiltrate her waking hours, too. She'd hear it in the rustling of the leaves outside her window, in the creaking of the old house settling, in the hum of the refrigerator. It was a constant, low thrum of sound, just beyond the edge of her perception, driving her slowly insane. One night, the whispering became clearer. Not words, exactly, but a voice, her voice. Sarah froze, her blood running cold. She strained to listen, her heart hammering against her ribs. And then she heard it, a faint, desperate plea. "Help me, please, help me." It was her voice, distorted and weak, but undeniably hers. A wave of terror washed over her. She slammed down the phone, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She stumbled out of bed, her legs shaking, and ran to the living room, flipping on the lights. The room was empty, bathed in the harsh glow of the overhead fixture, but the whispering was still there, echoing in her mind, a haunting echo of her own voice begging for salvation. She couldn't stay in the house any longer. She grabbed her keys and ran out into the night. The cool air a welcome shock against her feverish skin. She drove aimlessly for hours, the image of her own voice pleading for help burned into her brain. When the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky, she returned home, exhausted and terrified. She knew she couldn't stay there. The house, her sanctuary, had become a prison of fear. She put the house on the market immediately, fabricating a story about a sudden job transfer. She didn't tell anyone about the calls, about the whispering. They would have thought she was crazy. Within a few weeks, the house was sold. Sarah packed her belongings and left Westfield, vowing never to return. She tried to forget the calls, to bury the memory of her own voice crying out for help. She moved to a different state, started a new life. For a while, the calls stopped. She began to breathe again, to hope that she had escaped the nightmare. But the whispers, she knew, were still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. Years passed. Sarah had built a new life for herself in Colorado. She had a good job, a loving husband, and a beautiful daughter named Emily. The memories of Westfield, of the house on Linden Street, had faded like old photographs bleached by the sun. She rarely thought about the calls anymore. The whispers, they seemed like a distant nightmare, a figment of her imagination. She had convinced herself that it was all stress, an overactive imagination fueled by loneliness and the old house's unsettling ambience. Emily was a bright, curious child, full of energy and a thirst for adventure. She loved hearing stories about her mother's childhood, about the old Victorian house in New Jersey. Sarah would tell her about the stained glass windows, the creaky floorboards, the overgrown garden, carefully omitting the darker details. She wanted Emily to have only happy associations with the house, to see it as a place of wonder and magic, not fear. One summer, Sarah and her family decided to visit the East Coast. Sarah's husband, Mark, had never been to New Jersey, and Emily was eager to see the place where her mother had grown up. Sarah hesitated. A part of her, a deep, primal part, didn't want to go back. But she didn't want to deny Emily this experience, and she certainly didn't want to reveal the real reason for her reluctance. So, she agreed. They stayed in a small hotel in Westfield, not far from Linden Street. Driving past the old Victorian house, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. It looked the same as she remembered it, perhaps a little more weathered, the paint peeling, the garden overgrown once again. A for sale sign hung crookedly in the front yard. A wave of nostalgia washed over her, mixed with a deep, unsettling unease. "That's it," Emily exclaimed, pointing at the house. "That's the house you told me about." Sarah forced a smile. "Yes, honey, that's it. Can we go see it?" Emily asked, her eyes wide with excitement. Sarah hesitated. "I don't know, sweetie. It's probably private property now, but maybe we could just look from the outside?" Emily pleaded. Sarah couldn't deny her daughter's enthusiasm. She pulled the car over to the curb and parked. They got out and stood across the street, gazing at the house. "It's so big," Emily said. "And look at those windows." Sarah nodded, her gaze fixed on the house, a sense of dread creeping over her. It was as if the house was watching her, waiting. That night, Emily woke up screaming. Sarah rushed to her daughter's bedside, her heart pounding in her chest. "Mommy, there was a scary man in my room," Emily cried, her eyes wide with terror. "He was whispering things." Sarah held Emily close, trying to soothe her. "It was just a bad dream, sweetie," she whispered. "There's no scary man." But Emily insisted. "No, Mommy, he was there. I heard him. He was breathing really heavy, and he was whispering, like you told me about." Sarah froze. Her blood ran cold. She hadn't told Emily about the heavy breathing, about the whispering. How could she know? The next night, it happened again. Emily woke up screaming, claiming she heard the whispering again. Sarah was terrified. She knew what it was. The calls had followed her. They hadn't stopped. They had transferred to her daughter. The following days were filled with a growing sense of dread. Emily became withdrawn, fearful. She refused to sleep alone, insisting on sleeping in her parents' room. Sarah felt a familiar panic rising within her, the same terror she had experienced years ago in the house on Linden Street. She knew she had to do something, but she didn't know what. She couldn't tell Mark about the calls, about the whispering. He wouldn't understand. He'd think she was losing her mind. One afternoon, while Mark was at work, Sarah decided to do some research. She searched online for information about the house on Linden Street, hoping to find some clue, some explanation for what was happening. She discovered that the house had a reputation in the town, a dark history whispered in hushed tones. It was said that the house was haunted, that a family had died there tragically many years ago. The details were vague, shrouded in rumor and speculation. But one thing was clear: the house had a dark past. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. She knew now that the calls, the whispering, were connected to the house. They weren't just random occurrences. They were something more, something sinister. She had to find out the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. She had to protect her daughter. Sarah delved deeper into the history of the house on Linden Street. She visited the local library, poring over old newspaper articles and town records. She spoke to longtime residents of Westfield, people who had lived in the town their entire lives. Slowly, a picture began to emerge, a dark and disturbing picture of the house's past. The house, she learned, had been built in the late 1800s by a wealthy businessman named Elias Thorne. Thorne was a reclusive man, known for his eccentric behavior and his intense possessiveness over his family. He had a wife, Clara, and two daughters, Isabel and Beatrice. The family lived in the house on Linden Street, isolated from the rest of the town. Rumors swirled around the Thorne family. Some said that Elias was abusive, that he kept his wife and daughters prisoners in the house. Others whispered that Clara suffered from a mental illness, that she was prone to fits of hysteria. The truth was shrouded in secrecy. One night, in the early 1900s, tragedy struck the Thorne family. A fire broke out in the house, engulfing it in flames. Elias Thorne perished in the fire. Clara and her daughters were never found. Their bodies were presumed to have been consumed by the flames, but no remains were ever recovered. The fire became a local legend, a dark stain on the town's history. Some said that the spirits of the Thorne family still haunted the house, trapped between worlds, their tormented souls forever bound to the place of their demise. Others claimed that the fire was no accident, that Elias Thorne had deliberately set the blaze, killing his family and himself in a twisted act of desperation. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she read about the Thorne family. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together. The calls, the whispering, the feeling of dread. It all made sense now. The house wasn't just haunted. It was cursed, tainted by the tragic events of the past. She returned to the hotel, her mind reeling. She knew she had to leave Westfield, to take Emily away from the house, away from the whispers. But she also knew that running away wasn't enough. The calls had followed her to Colorado. They would follow her anywhere. She had to confront the source of the evil, to unravel the mystery of the Thorne family, to lay their tormented spirits to rest. The next day, Sarah decided to visit the house on Linden Street again. She couldn't explain why, but she felt drawn to the house, as if it was calling her. She needed to see it again, to feel its presence, to understand its secrets. She drove to Linden Street and parked across from the house. It looked even more menacing in the daylight, its darkened windows like vacant eyes staring out at the world. Sarah hesitated, her hand hovering over the door handle. She knew she was taking a risk, venturing into the heart of darkness. But she had no choice. She had to do it for Emily. She got out of the car and crossed the street, her footsteps echoing on the deserted sidewalk. She walked up the overgrown path to the front door, her heart pounding in her chest. The "For Sale" sign still hung crookedly in the yard, a silent testament to the house's troubled past. She reached the front door and tried the handle. It was locked. She peered through the dusty windows, trying to see inside. The interior of the house was dark and shadowy, filled with a thick layer of dust. She could make out some furniture, covered in white sheets, like ghosts draped in shrouds. She walked around the house, trying to find another way in. She found a side door that was slightly ajar. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The air inside the house was heavy and stale, thick with the scent of dust and decay. It was eerily silent, except for the faint creaking of the floorboards beneath her feet. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She knew she was not alone. She walked through the house, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She explored the empty rooms, each one filled with a sense of sadness and despair. She could feel the presence of the Thorne family, their pain, their suffering. She could almost hear their whispers, echoing through the empty halls. She found the living room, where the fire had started. The walls were blackened with soot, the air still thick with the smell of smoke. She could almost see the flames, hear the crackling of the fire, the screams of the dying family. She closed her eyes, trying to connect with the spirits of the Thorne family. She wanted to understand their story, to offer them comfort, to help them find peace. And then she heard it, a faint whisper, coming from the corner of the room. "Help us." Sarah's eyes snapped open. She whirled around, scanning the room. The whisper seemed to hang in the air, a fragile echo of a long-ago tragedy. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. Silence. Only the creaking of the old house settling around her. Sarah took a tentative step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached the corner of the room and peered into the shadows. Nothing. "Help us!" The whisper came again, softer this time, as if carried on the breath of a ghost. Sarah felt a cold spot in the air, a palpable shift in the atmosphere. She was not imagining it. She was in the presence of something else. She closed her eyes again, focusing on the whispers, trying to decipher their meaning. "Help us?" The words were faint, but clear now. Sarah realized they weren't directed at her. Not exactly. They were a cry from the past, a desperate plea echoing through time. She opened her eyes and looked around the room again. Her gaze fell on a small, dusty portrait hanging on the wall. It was a portrait of a woman, dressed in a long, elegant gown. Her face was pale and delicate, her eyes filled with sadness. Sarah recognized her instantly. It was Clara Thorne. Sarah approached the portrait, her hand reaching out to touch the dusty glass. As her fingers brushed against the frame, she felt a jolt, a surge of energy that made her gasp. Images flashed through her mind. A dark figure standing in the shadows, a woman screaming, flames engulfing a room. She saw Clara Thorne, her face contorted in fear, her arms outstretched, pleading for help. Sarah recoiled, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She stumbled back, her hand clutching her chest. The images were so vivid, so real. She knew now what had happened. It wasn't Elias Thorne who had set the fire. It was Clara, driven to madness by her husband's abuse. She had taken the lives of her daughters and then herself, choosing a fiery death over a life of torment. But her spirit and the spirits of her daughters were trapped in the house, forever reliving their final moments of terror. Sarah understood now why the whispers had followed her. They weren't trying to harm her. They were trying to tell her their story, to reveal the truth. They needed her help to find peace. Sarah felt a wave of compassion wash over her. She knew what she had to do. She had to help them. She turned back to the portrait of Clara Thorne. "I understand," she whispered. "I know what happened." As she spoke the words, the room seemed to grow colder, the air thicker. The whispering intensified, swirling around her like a ghostly wind. Sarah closed her eyes, focusing on the sounds, trying to make sense of the chaos. And then she heard it, a clear, distinct voice cutting through the whispers. "Tell them the truth." Sarah opened her eyes. She knew who she had to tell. She had to tell the town of Westfield, to reveal the secrets of the Thorne family, to expose the truth about the fire. She had to bring their story to light, to finally set their spirits free. She left the house on Linden Street, her heart filled with a sense of purpose. She knew it wouldn't be easy. The truth was buried deep, hidden beneath layers of rumor and speculation. But she was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. She went to the local newspaper, the Westfield Gazette, and told them her story. At first, they were skeptical, dismissing her claims as the ramblings of a disturbed woman. But Sarah was persistent. She showed them the research she had done, the historical records she had uncovered. She spoke of the whispers, the visions, the chilling presence she had felt in the house on Linden Street. Slowly, they began to believe her. They investigated her claims, digging into the archives, interviewing longtime residents of Westfield. They discovered the truth about Elias Thorne's abusive behavior, about Clara's fragile mental state. They confirmed the details of the fire, the mysterious disappearance of Clara and her daughters. The story of the Thorne family was finally brought to light, published in a series of articles in the Westfield Gazette. The town was shocked, their long-held assumptions shattered. The truth, as it often does, was far more complex and tragic than anyone could have imagined. With the truth revealed, something shifted. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the house on Linden Street began to dissipate. The whispers faded, replaced by an eerie silence. The tormented spirits of the Thorne family, finally at peace, were gone. Sarah returned to Colorado, leaving the house on Linden Street behind. The calls stopped. Emily slept peacefully through the night. The nightmare was finally over. But Sarah would never forget the whispers, the haunting cries from the past. She had faced the darkness and emerged with the truth, a truth that had set not only the spirits of the Thorne family free, but also herself. The Vanishing of Louis Prince, Dijon, France, September 16, 1890. The air hung thick with the scent of autumn, a crispness that hinted at the coming winter. Louis Prince, a man with a mind buzzing with innovation and a heart brimming with ambition, stood on the platform of the Dijaville railway station. He clutched his worn leather briefcase, its contents holding the future of entertainment, the secrets of moving pictures. He had spent years perfecting his invention, a single-lens camera capable of capturing motion, a feat that would revolutionize the world. He was on his way to Paris, ready to unveil his creation to the world, to solidify his place in history. Prince was a quiet man, not one for boisterous pronouncements or grand gestures. His passion resided in his work, in the intricate mechanics of his camera, in the magic he could conjure with light and celluloid. He had already filmed several short sequences, including the iconic Roundhay Garden scene, the oldest surviving motion picture. He knew he was on the verge of something extraordinary. He boarded the 5:15 p.m. train to Paris, a first-class carriage promising comfort and solitude. He found a quiet compartment, the rhythmic clatter of the train wheels a soothing backdrop to his thoughts. He imagined the gasps of wonder as his films flickered to life on the screen, the accolades, the recognition. He was so close. The train chugged along, passing through the picturesque French countryside. Prince gazed out the window, the rolling hills and vineyards a blur of green and gold. He made some notes in his small leather-bound notebook, refining his plans for the Paris demonstration. He was meticulous, a true perfectionist. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, Prince felt a strange unease. It wasn't anything specific, just a general feeling of unease. He shrugged it off, attributing it to the long journey and the weight of his upcoming presentation. The train pulled into the Auxerre station around 7 p.m. A few passengers disembarked and others boarded. Prince remained in his compartment, lost in his thoughts. He didn't notice the man who entered the compartment next door, a tall, gaunt figure with piercing blue eyes. He didn't hear the soft click of the compartment door as it closed. The train continued its journey, the darkness outside the windows deepening. Prince decided to organize his notes, laying them out on the small table in front of him. He meticulously reviewed each point, ensuring he was prepared for any questions. He glanced at his pocket watch. It was almost 8 p.m. They would be arriving in Paris late in the evening. He felt a sudden weariness wash over him. He decided to rest for a while, just until they reached the next station. He leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes. The rhythmic swaying of the train lulled him into a light sleep. He dreamt of his invention, of the images flickering to life, of the audience captivated by his moving pictures. He didn't hear the soft creak of the compartment door as it opened. He didn't see the shadow that fell across him. He didn't feel the cold breath on his neck. When the train arrived in Paris the following morning, Louis Prince was gone. The train pulled into the Gare de Lyon station in Paris, the bustling platform alive with the sounds of vendors, porters, and arriving passengers. A conductor walked through the carriages, announcing the arrival. He reached Lou Prince's compartment and knocked on the door. Silence. He tried the handle. It was unlocked. He opened the door and peered inside. The compartment was empty. Lou Prince's briefcase was still on the seat, untouched. His coat hung on the hook. His hat rested on the overhead rack. His notebook lay open on the table, the pages filled with his meticulous notes. Everything was there, except for Lou Prince himself. The conductor was puzzled. He checked the adjoining compartments. They were all empty. He asked the other passengers if they had seen Lou Prince, but no one had noticed anything unusual. He reported the missing passenger to the station authorities. They searched the train thoroughly, but there was no sign of Lou Prince. His disappearance was a complete mystery. The police were called in. They interviewed the passengers, the train staff, everyone who might have seen Lou Prince. No one could offer any explanation for his disappearance. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The investigation focused on the possibility of foul play. Had Lou Prince been robbed and murdered? Had he been the victim of an accident? The police searched the train tracks, the surrounding countryside, but found no trace of his body. The mystery deepened. Lou Prince's family was notified. They were devastated by the news. They couldn't understand how he could have disappeared so completely. He was a quiet, unassuming man. He had no known enemies. The police explored other avenues. Had Lou Prince run away? Was he suffering from some kind of mental breakdown? These theories seemed unlikely. Lou Prince was a dedicated inventor, focused on his work. He had no reason to abandon his life and disappear. The case of the vanishing inventor became a national sensation. Newspapers ran headlines about the mysterious disappearance of Louis Lou Prince. Theories abounded. Some speculated that he had been kidnapped by a rival inventor, eager to steal his secrets. Others suggested that he had stumbled upon something dangerous, something that powerful forces wanted to keep hidden. One theory, whispered in hushed tones, was that Lou Prince's invention was not what it seemed. What if his moving pictures were not just a technological marvel, but something more? What if they had the power to capture not just images, but something else, something supernatural? This theory gained traction among those who were familiar with Lou Prince's work. They pointed to the strange, almost hypnotic quality of his films. They noted the way the images seemed to flicker and dance, as if they were alive. They wondered if Lou Prince had inadvertently opened a door to something beyond our understanding. The police dismissed these theories as fanciful speculation. They focused on more rational explanations. But the mystery remained unsolved. Louis Lou Prince had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a legacy of innovation and a chilling enigma. Weeks turned into months, and months into years. The official investigation into Lou Prince's disappearance eventually faded, relegated to the cold case files. But the mystery continued to haunt those who knew him, those who had seen his films, those who were intrigued by the unexplained. Rumors began to circulate, whispers of strange occurrences connected to Lou Prince's films. Some claimed that viewing his films induced unsettling feelings, a sense of unease, a feeling of being watched. Others reported seeing fleeting, shadowy figures in the background of his films, figures that were not visible when the films were projected normally. These rumors, combined with the mysterious circumstances of Lou Prince's disappearance, fueled the speculation about the supernatural nature of his invention. Some believed that Lou Prince had inadvertently captured something malevolent on film, something that had reached out and taken him. One particular story emerged, a tale of a shadowy figure seen in the background of the Roundhay Garden scene. This figure, barely visible, seemed to be watching the people in the film, its eyes fixed on them with an unsettling intensity. Some who had seen the figure claimed it was not human. The story spread, becoming an urban legend. People began to scrutinize Lou Prince's films, searching for the shadowy figure. Some claimed to have seen it, while others dismissed it as imagination or trick of the light. But the rumors persisted, adding to the mystique surrounding Lou Prince and his invention. The idea that his films were not just recordings of reality, but portals to something else, something unseen, took root in the popular imagination. Meanwhile, Luprince's family continued to search for answers. They hired private investigators, hoping to uncover some clue to his disappearance. They followed every lead, no matter how improbable. But their efforts were fruitless. Louis Luprince remained a ghost, a phantom presence in the world he had helped to create. One of the investigators, a former police officer named Jean-Pierre Dubois, became obsessed with the case. He delved into Luprince's background, studying his notes, examining his films. He became convinced that there was more to the story than met the eye. Dubois was intrigued by the rumors of the shadowy figure. He spent countless hours analyzing Luprince's films, frame by frame. He used magnifying glasses, image enhancement software, everything he could think of to try and find the figure. One night, while reviewing the Roundhay Garden scene, Dubois noticed something. In the background, behind the group of people, a faint shadow flickered for a single frame. It was barely perceptible, easily missed if one wasn't looking for it. Dubois froze the frame and zoomed in. The shadow resolved itself into a figure, a tall, gaunt figure with piercing eyes. It was the same figure described in the rumors. Dubois felt a chill run down his spine. He had found it. The shadowy figure. It was real. Not just a figment of imagination, but a tangible presence captured on film. But what was it? He spent the next few days obsessively studying the figure. He showed the frame to other experts, asking for their opinions. Some dismissed it as a photographic anomaly, a trick of light and shadow. Others were more intrigued, suggesting it could be a person standing in the background, partially obscured by the lighting. But Dubois wasn't convinced. The figure was too indistinct, too ethereal. It didn't look like a normal person. It seemed to be translucent, almost like a ghost. He began to delve into the occult, researching folklore, legends, anything that might shed light on the figure's nature. He discovered stories of shadow people, spectral beings that were said to inhabit the fringes of reality, sometimes glimpsed in photographs and films. Could it be? Could Luprince have inadvertently captured a shadow person on film? And if so, what did it mean? Dubois became increasingly convinced that Luprince's disappearance was connected to the figure. He believed that Luprince had stumbled upon something dangerous, something that had reached out and taken him. He decided to investigate further, to try and uncover the truth behind the figure and Luprince's disappearance. He returned to Dijon, the place where Luprince had last been seen. He visited the train station, the platform where Luprince had boarded the train. He tried to recreate Luprince's journey, hoping to find some clue, some missing piece of the puzzle. He spent hours walking the streets of Dijon, retracing Luprince's steps. He visited the hotel where Luprince had stayed the night before his disappearance. He interviewed the hotel staff, asking if they remembered anything unusual about Luprince. One of the staff members, an elderly woman named Madame Dubois, no relation to Jean-Pierre, remembered Luprince vividly. She described him as a quiet, polite man. She recalled that he had spent most of his time in his room, working on his notes and his camera. She also mentioned something else. She said that Luprince had received a strange visitor the night before his disappearance, a tall, gaunt man with piercing blue eyes. The man had stayed in Luprince's room for several hours. Madame Dubois had overheard them talking, but she couldn't understand what they were saying. She said it sounded like they were speaking in a strange language. Dubois's heart pounded. The description matched the shadowy figure in the film. It also matched the description of the man seen entering the compartment next to Luprince's on the train. He asked Madame Dubois if she remembered anything else about the visitor. She said that he had left early in the morning, just before Luprince boarded the train. She also said that he had left behind a small, leather-bound book. Dubois asked if she still had the book. She said that she did, that she had kept it all these years. She went to her room and returned with the book. Dubois examined the book. It was filled with strange symbols and writing. He didn't recognize the language. It looked like some kind of ancient script. He took the book back to Paris. He showed it to linguists, historians, experts in ancient languages. No one could decipher it. Du Bois was frustrated. He felt like he was so close to the truth, but he couldn't quite grasp it. He knew that the book held the key to the mystery, but he couldn't unlock its secrets. He decided to try a different approach. He contacted a psychic, a woman who claimed to have the ability to communicate with the spirit world. He showed her the book and asked if she could tell him anything about it. The psychic took the book in her hands and closed her eyes. She remained silent for several minutes. Then, she began to speak, her voice low and raspy. She said that the book was a grimoire, a book of magic. It contained spells and incantations, rituals for summoning spirits. She said that the language was ancient Sumerian. She also said that the book was connected to Lou Prince's disappearance. She said that he had used the book to try and capture something on film, something that should not have been captured. She said that he had opened a door to another dimension and something had come through. Du Bois was stunned. He had suspected that Lou Prince's invention was connected to the supernatural, but he had never imagined that it was this dangerous. The psychic continued. She said that the shadowy figure was a demon, a malevolent entity that had been trapped in the book for centuries. She said that Lou Prince had unwittingly released it. She said that the demon had taken Lou Prince, dragged him into the other dimension. She said that he was still alive, but trapped, a prisoner of the demon. Du Bois felt a wave of horror wash over him. He had to do something. He had to save Lou Prince. The psychic told Du Bois that there was a way to bring Lou Prince back, a ritual that could close the door to the other dimension. But it was dangerous. It required the grimoire, specific ingredients, and a precise sequence of incantations. Du Bois knew that he was taking a risk. He was venturing into the unknown, into a world of magic and demons. But he was determined to save Lou Prince, no matter the cost. He gathered the ingredients, following the psychic's instructions. He found a secluded place, an ancient stone circle in the French countryside, said to be a place of power. He laid out the ingredients, arranged them according to the ritual specifications. He opened the grimoire and began to chant the incantations, his voice echoing through the night. As he spoke the ancient words, the air grew heavy, charged with an unseen energy. The shadows deepened, twisting into grotesque shapes. A cold wind swept through the stone circle, chilling Du Bois to the bone. He continued chanting, his voice growing stronger, more confident. The ground began to tremble. A faint light emanated from the grimoire, casting eerie shadows on the surrounding stones. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the center of the stone circle. It was tall and gaunt, with piercing blue eyes. The shadowy figure. Du Bois felt a surge of fear, but he didn't falter. He continued chanting, his voice rising to a crescendo. The figure began to writhe, its form flickering and distorting. It let out a guttural scream, a sound that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The light from the grimoire faded. The ground stopped trembling. The wind died down. Silence descended upon the stone circle, broken only by Du Bois's ragged breathing. He looked around, searching for Lou Prince. And then he saw him. He was lying on the ground, unconscious. Du Bois rushed to his side. He checked his pulse. He was alive. He carefully lifted Lou Prince and carried him out of the stone circle. He took him back to Paris, to his family. Lou Prince remained unconscious for several days. When he finally awoke, he remembered nothing of his ordeal. He had no recollection of the demon, the grimoire, or the other dimension. He only remembered boarding the train to Paris and then waking up in a hospital bed. Du Bois never told Lou Prince the truth about his disappearance. He knew that it would be too much for him to bear. He kept the grimoire hidden away, locked in a safe place, vowing never to open it again. The mystery of Louis Lou Prince's disappearance was never officially solved. The world believed that he had simply vanished, a victim of circumstance or foul play. But Du Bois knew the truth. He knew that Lou Prince had stumbled upon something dangerous, something that had reached out and taken him. And he knew that he had brought him back, at great personal risk. He never spoke of his experience, keeping the secret locked away in his heart. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled and the shadows danced, he would think of Le Prince, and he would remember the whispers in the dark. The Devil's Footprints. The winter of 1855 descended upon Devon, England, like a shroud. Snow fell relentlessly, blanketing the rolling hills and quaint villages in a thick, pristine layer. For days, the world was hushed, muffled by the soft, constant fall of flakes. Children rejoiced, building snowmen and engaging in playful skirmishes, while adults grumbled good-naturedly, shoveling paths and tending to their livestock. The isolation, however, was starting to wear thin. The constant gray skies and the enforced stillness seemed to seep into the very bones of the community. Then came the morning after the heaviest snowfall. Devon woke to a world transformed. The snow had finally ceased, leaving behind a landscape of dazzling white under a crisp, clear sky. But something was different. Something was wrong. It started with a whisper, a hushed conversation between neighbors over steaming mugs of tea. Had anyone seen the tracks? Strange tracks, unlike any they'd ever witnessed. The whispers grew into murmurs, then into exclamations as more and more people ventured out into the snow. The tracks were everywhere. They were hoof-like, deeply imprinted in the fresh snow, as if a large, cloven-hoofed animal had passed through. But these were no ordinary animal tracks. They were perfectly aligned, forming a single, unbroken line that stretched for over 100 miles. The line was unervingly straight, deviating neither to the left nor the right, as if guided by an unseen hand. It traversed fields, climbed over walls, crossed rooftops, and even plunged into rivers, reappearing on the opposite bank without a break. The tracks were too large for any known animal in the region. They were too precise, too unwavering in their path, and they were utterly, undeniably bizarre. Fear began to stir in the hearts of the villagers, a cold dread that settled in the pit of their stomachs. What creature could have made such tracks? What unearthly being had walked across their land in the dead of night? Initially, theories abounded. Some suggested a runaway horse, its hooves unusually shaped or shod. Others spoke of escaped kangaroos from a private menagerie, though the likelihood of a kangaroo surviving the harsh Devon winter was slim. The local vicar, a learned man, pondered over ancient bestiaries, searching for clues, but found nothing that matched the strange prints. As the days passed, the mystery deepened. The tracks remained, stubbornly resisting the thaw. They became a focal point, a source of constant discussion and speculation. Children, initially fascinated, now spoke of the tracks in hushed tones, their games tinged with a newfound fear. Adults gathered in the local pub, the Hound and Hare, their usual jovial banter replaced by worried speculation. Stories, both ancient and newly invented, circulated about phantom hounds and demonic creatures that roamed the countryside at night. The most unsettling aspect of the tracks was their sheer impossibility. They defied logic and reason. How could an animal, any animal, walk in a straight line for such a distance, crossing obstacles that should have been impassable? The tracks seemed to mock the very laws of nature, hinting at something supernatural. The unease in Devon grew. People began to lock their doors earlier, peering nervously out into the night. The silence, once comforting, now felt oppressive, filled with unseen presences and the whisper of the wind that sounded suspiciously like the padding of unseen hooves. The snow, once a symbol of winter's beauty, now seemed to hold a sinister secret, a blank canvas upon which an unknown entity had etched its mark. The villagers were trapped in a shared nightmare, bound together by the chilling mystery of the Devil's Footprints. The name stuck, whispered at first, then spoken openly, the Devil's Footprints. It was a moniker born of fear and ignorance, a desperate attempt to label something that defied explanation. The tracks, after all, seemed to possess an unholy quality, a defiance of the natural order that hinted at a malevolent force. The local newspaper, the Exeter and Plymouth Gazette, initially dismissed the reports as rustic fancy and exaggerated tales. However, the sheer number of eyewitness accounts and the growing unrest in the community forced them to take notice. They dispatched a reporter, a young man named Edward Snow, to investigate the phenomenon. Snow, a skeptic by nature, arrived in Devon armed with a notebook, a camera, and a healthy dose of disbelief. He interviewed witnesses, examined the tracks, and even attempted to follow them. But the sheer scale of the phenomenon overwhelmed him. The tracks stretched as far as the eye could see, an unbroken line that seemed to mock his attempts to find a rational explanation. He wrote of the tracks in his articles, describing them in detail and documenting the growing fear in the community. He tried to remain objective, but the sheer strangeness of the situation seeped into his writing, imbuing his reports with a sense of unease that resonated with his readers. The Gazette's circulation soared as people across the country became captivated by the mystery of the devil's footprints. Theories continued to emerge, each more outlandish than the last. Some suggested a hoax, a prank orchestrated by a group of mischievous individuals with unusually shaped boots. Others spoke of a meteorological phenomenon, a bizarre combination of wind and snow that created the illusion of footprints. Still others clung to the supernatural explanation, whispering of demons, witches, and even the devil himself. The scientific community, however, remained largely unconvinced. They demanded evidence, proof that could withstand scrutiny. But the tracks offered no such proof. They were simply there, an anomaly that defied explanation. Some scientists suggested that the tracks were made by a badger, its footprints elongated by the melting snow. Others proposed a balloon, dragging a rope with a hook that had created the impressions. These explanations, however, failed to account for the sheer scale and precision of the tracks, their unwavering straight line, and their ability to cross seemingly impossible obstacles. As the weeks passed, the mystery of the devil's footprints deepened. The tracks remained, a constant reminder of the unknown entity that had walked through their midst. The fear in Devon, once a simmering unease, began to boil over. People avoided going out at night, and even during the day, they traveled in groups, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of the creature that had made the tracks. The devil's footprints had become more than just a local curiosity. They had become a symbol of the unknown, a reminder that the world was a stranger and more unsettling place than they had ever imagined. The tracks had shaken their sense of security, their belief in the rational order of things. They were a crack in the veneer of their reality, a glimpse into a world where the impossible was possible, and where the darkness that lurked at the edges of their perception could, at any moment, step into the light. The Myrtles Plantation Ghost. The humid Louisiana air hung heavy, thick as a shroud, even as dusk painted the sky in bruised purples and fiery oranges. I pulled my rental car onto the gravel drive of the Myrtles Plantation, a shiver running down my spine despite the lingering heat. I'd always been fascinated by ghost stories, the kind that whispered on the edge of reality, the ones that clung to places like cobwebs, refusing to be brushed away. The Myrtles, with its reputation as one of America's most haunted houses, had been calling to me for years. I was a writer, researching a book on haunted locations, and this was the perfect place to delve into the shadows. The plantation loomed before me, a grand, two-story structure draped in Spanish moss that swayed like spectral fingers in the gentle breeze. The white paint was peeling in places, revealing the aged wood beneath, and some of the windows looked like vacant eyes staring out into the twilight. A sense of unease settled over me, a feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination, fueled by years of reading about the plantation's dark history, but the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I parked the car and stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath my feet. The air smelled of damp earth and something else, something faintly floral, almost sickly sweet. I couldn't quite place it, but it made my stomach churn. I grabbed my bag from the back seat, my hand brushing against my recorder and camera, tools of my trade, but also talismans against the unknown. The plantation was open for tours, but I'd arrived late, intentionally. I wanted to experience the house when it was quiet, when the veil between worlds was said to be at its thinnest. I'd arranged with the caretaker, a grizzled old man named Silas, for a private tour after hours. He'd seemed reluctant at first, muttering about things best left undisturbed, but a few extra dollars had loosened his tongue. As I walked towards the main entrance, I noticed a small, overgrown garden to the side of the house. Willows wept over a crumbling stone fountain, their branches brushing the ground like mournful sighs. I felt drawn to the garden, a sense of melancholy washing over me. The air here was even heavier, the floral scent stronger, almost overwhelming. I took a deep breath, trying to identify it. Magnolia? Jasmine? Something else, something darker. Suddenly, a whisper, faint as the rustle of leaves, reached my ears. I stopped, my heart pounding. "Help me," it seemed to say. I whirled around, but there was no one there. Just the willows, swaying gently in the breeze. I told myself it was my imagination, the product of a long drive and an overactive imagination. But the whisper had sounded so real, so desperate. I shook it off and continued towards the house. Silas was waiting for me on the porch, a lantern casting long, flickering shadows across his weathered face. He nodded curtly and unlocked the heavy oak door. "You sure about this, miss?" he asked, his voice raspy. "This ain't no ordinary house. Things happen here, things that can't be explained." "I'm sure, Silas," I replied, trying to sound braver than I felt. "I've done my research. I know the stories." "Stories ain't the same as living them," he muttered, pushing the door open. "Come on then. But don't say I didn't warn you." The interior of the Myrtles was even more imposing than I had imagined. High ceilings, ornate chandeliers, and antique furniture filled the rooms. Dust motes danced in the lantern light, creating an ethereal atmosphere. Silas led me through the grand foyer, its walls adorned with portraits of stern-faced individuals, their eyes seeming to follow me as I passed. "This is the main house," Silas said, his voice echoing through the silent halls. "Built in 1790, it's seen a lot in its time. Joy, sorrow, life, and death." He paused, glancing at me with a knowing look. "And some say the echoes of those who lived here still linger." He took me through the various rooms, each one filled with its own unsettling history. The dining room, where legend had it, Chloe, the mistreated slave, had poisoned the family's children. The master bedroom, where a former owner had been shot and killed. The children's nursery, where visitors often reported hearing the sound of laughter and crying. The air grew colder as we ascended the grand staircase to the second floor. I could feel the weight of the house's history pressing down on me, a palpable sense of sadness and despair. Silas's lantern flickered, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. He stopped in front of a room at the end of the hall. "This is the room where Chloe, where it's said she met her end," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I hesitated, a knot forming in my stomach. This was the room I'd been most curious about, and yet I was also terrified to enter. Silas pushed the door open, revealing a small, sparsely furnished room. The only piece of furniture was a large, ornate mirror hanging on one wall. It was an antique, its silver backing tarnished with age. "Be careful with that mirror," Silas warned. "Some folks say Chloe's spirit is trapped inside it. They say if you look into it long enough, you can see her reflection." I approached the mirror cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The floral scent was stronger here, almost suffocating. I peered into the glass, my own reflection staring back at me. A pale, nervous face. I looked closer, trying to see if there was anything else, anything different. But it was just me. Or was it? As I continued to gaze into the mirror, a strange sensation washed over me. The room seemed to grow colder, the air thicker. My reflection began to waver, to distort. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw another face superimposed over my own. A dark-skinned woman with sad, haunted eyes. I gasped and stumbled back from the mirror, my breath catching in my throat. "Did you see it?" I asked Silas, my voice trembling. He nodded slowly. "I've seen things in that mirror," he said. "Things I can't explain." I stared at the mirror, my mind racing. Had I really seen Chloe's reflection? Or was it just my imagination playing tricks on me? I decided to take a picture of the mirror, hoping to capture whatever it was I thought I'd seen. I raised my camera and snapped a photo. The flash illuminated the room, momentarily blinding me. When I lowered the camera and looked at the mirror again, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small, almost imperceptible handprint on the glass. It looked like the hand of a child. A chill ran down my spine. The handprint, it was too small to be Chloe's. Could it belong to one of the children she was said to have poisoned? Silas and I left the room. The image of the handprint burned into my mind. We continued our tour of the second floor, visiting the other rooms, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The whispers seemed to follow us, faint and indistinct, like the rustling of leaves in a distant forest. As we walked down the hallway, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A child's cry. It was faint, muffled, but unmistakable. It seemed to be coming from one of the rooms nearby. I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I asked Silas. He nodded, his face grim. "The children's nursery," he said. "They say their spirits still roam these halls." I felt a wave of fear wash over me, but also a strange sense of curiosity. I had to know what was happening. I grabbed Silas's lantern and cautiously approached the room from which the cry seemed to be emanating. The door was slightly ajar, casting a sliver of light into the darkened hallway. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small and sparsely furnished, with a few antique toys scattered on the floor. A rocking horse stood in the corner, its painted eyes staring blankly ahead. The air was cold, even colder than in the other rooms. The floral scent was almost overpowering here, making my head spin. The crying continued, soft and mournful. It seemed to be coming from the corner of the room, near a small, wooden cradle. I approached the cradle cautiously, my hand trembling. I peered inside, expecting to see. What? I didn't know. The cradle was empty. I looked around the room, my eyes searching for any sign of a child. The cradle was empty. I scanned the room again, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. The crying continued, echoing through the small space. Yet there was no one there, just the antique toys, the rocking horse, and the empty cradle. The floral scent, that cloying mix of magnolia and something darker, filled my nostrils, making me feel lightheaded. "Is anyone here?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The only answer was the continued crying, a sound that tugged at something deep within me. A primal fear mingled with a strange sense of empathy. Silas stood behind me in the doorway, his face pale in the flickering lantern light. "Miss, we should go," he said, his voice urgent. "This ain't a place for the living after dark." I knew he was right. Everything about this room, about this house, screamed danger. But I couldn't just leave. The crying, it sounded so real, so desperate. I felt a pull towards it, a need to understand. "Just a minute," I said, turning back to the room. I took a step closer to the cradle, my hand reaching out to touch the smooth, worn wood. As my fingers brushed against the cradle's edge, the crying intensified, rising to a crescendo of heart-wrenching sobs. Suddenly, a cold gust of air swept through the room, extinguishing Silas's lantern and plunging us into darkness. I gasped, stumbling backwards, my hand flying to my mouth. The crying was deafening now, filling the room with a chorus of sorrow. "Silas!" I cried, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm here, miss," he replied, his voice strained. I could hear him fumbling for his lighter. A small spark ignited, revealing his anxious face. He relit the lantern, the flickering flame casting dancing shadows across the walls. The crying had subsided, replaced by an eerie silence. I looked around the room, my eyes straining to pierce the darkness. Everything seemed normal, yet the air was thick with an oppressive energy, a feeling of being watched. "Did you see anything?" I asked Silas, my voice trembling. He shook his head. Nothing, Mississippi. Just the dark. I wasn't convinced. I felt something in that room. Something unseen. Something malevolent. We left the nursery, the silence broken only by the sound of our footsteps echoing down the hallway. As we reached the top of the stairs, I heard another sound, faint but distinct. The creaking of a swing. There was no swing in the house. I'd seen the plans earlier, and there was no mention of one. Yet, the creaking was unmistakable, the rhythmic squeak of metal on metal. Did you hear that? I asked Silas, my heart pounding in my chest. He paused, listening. Hear what, miss? The swing, I said. Don't you hear it? He shook his head again. I don't hear nothing, Mississippi. Just the wind. But it wasn't the wind. The air was still, the Spanish moss hanging limp and lifeless. The creaking continued, growing louder, as if the swing was getting closer. I looked down the hallway, towards the darkened end where the nursery was located. The creaking seemed to be coming from that direction. A chill ran down my spine. What if the swing was in the nursery? What if something was using it? We have to go back, I said, turning to Silas. He looked at me as if I were crazy. Miss, are you sure? We should leave. Now. I have to know, I said, my voice firm. I can't leave without knowing what's happening. Silas hesitated, then sighed. All right, miss, he said. But if we see anything out of the ordinary, we're leaving. No questions asked. I nodded, grabbing the lantern from his hand. We walked back down the hallway, the creaking of the swing growing louder with each step. As we approached the nursery, I could see a faint light flickering inside. It wasn't the lantern. It was something else, something ethereal. We reached the nursery door and peered inside. The room was bathed in an eerie glow, the source of which seemed to be the rocking horse in the corner. It was rocking back and forth, slowly and deliberately, as if someone were sitting on it. But there was no one there. The creaking of the swing was deafening now, filling the room with its rhythmic squeak. I looked around, my eyes searching for the source of the sound. Then I saw it. In the corner of the room, near the cradle, a swing had materialized out of thin air. It was an old-fashioned swing, made of wood and metal, its chains creaking and swaying as if someone were using it. But, like the rocking horse, it was empty. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. A swing, appearing out of nowhere, rocking back and forth with no one on it. It was impossible. Silas gasped, his eyes wide with fear. Miss, we have to go, he whispered, grabbing my arm. I wanted to run, to flee from the room, from the house, from whatever unseen presence was manipulating these objects. But I was frozen in place, my mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. The rocking horse continued to rock, the swing continued to sway, and the room was filled with the sounds of creaking wood and metal. The air grew colder, the floral scent stronger, almost suffocating. I felt a presence in the room, something unseen, something evil. Suddenly, the crying started again, louder than before. It was coming from the cradle, which was now rocking back and forth as well. I stared at the cradle, my heart pounding in my chest. What was inside? I took a step closer, my hand reaching out to touch the cradle. As my fingers brushed against the wood, the crying intensified, and a small, pale hand reached out from inside the cradle, grasping at my hand. I screamed, recoiling in horror. The hand. It was translucent, ghostly. It was the hand I had seen in the mirror, the hand of a child. Silas pulled me back, his face white with terror. We're leaving, miss, he shouted, dragging me towards the door. We ran out of the nursery, out of the house and into the night. I didn't stop running until we reached the car, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Silas unlocked the door, and I climbed inside, my body shaking uncontrollably. He got in beside me, started the engine, and sped away from the Myrtles plantation, leaving its dark secrets behind. As we drove away, I looked back at the house, its silhouette looming against the night sky. I could almost hear the crying, the creaking of the swing, the rocking of the horse, the sounds of the children's spirits trapped forever within the walls of the Myrtles. And I knew, deep down, that I would never forget what I had seen that night. The hand in the cradle, the swing appearing from thin air, the unseen presence that filled the room. The Myrtles plantation had revealed its secrets to me, and they were secrets I would carry with me forever. The world is full of mysteries, some lurking just beneath the surface, others waiting in the dark, daring us to uncover their secrets. But maybe some questions are better left unanswered. What do you believe? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey into the unexplained, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a story. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and don't look too long into the abyss. You never know what might be looking back.